So one of the things that happened going through my own domestic violence situation is that I started to talk with other survivors about their experiences in different systems, and I also spoke with a handful of pastors about what was happening in their churches. So one of the last meetings I had with a survivor was with you, and you were kind of the impetus behind getting this summit together because of our shared experiences. Do you want to talk a little bit about what happened to you, or what brought us together that fateful day in Schenectady, New York?
God. That's the short answer. So so I was the victim of domestic violence. My husband had an undiagnosed mental health issue that became ragingly out of control, and we had to ask him to leave. And at that point, I went back to college and I became a public health educator. And so I had spent the last 15 years really educating people on healthcare from a perspective of social, emotional, spiritual, and physical health. And so domestic violence is a key piece of that.
Absolutely.
And especially what is often ignored is the spiritual health aspect of domestic violence.
Now, to pause for just 1 second, you've actually already been involved. We have this DV Summit that's coming up on January 20th, but you are also part of the Warrior Women's Conference that happens all across the Capital District, and you have 2 ministries.
Yes. Well, I have a nonprofit, Health Literacy for All, which is the official sponsoring agency, and then it has an offshoot that is faith-based, that is Apple of His Eye Ministries, that focuses more on the health of the church. So what do you need to get your church to the next level? Do you need better sound equipment? Do you need somebody who's got a prayer team? What do you need? What does your church need? And how do I help you find that?
And so that was part of the conversation we had a few months ago when you and I sat down to have our delicious lattes. Can you tell me about what you've seen in the church and what your experience has been with the needs in the church regarding domestic violence?
So after COVID, the churches really sort of became very insular. People left, they didn't come back. And what I noticed was there was just in general an increase in the domestic violence. And you know that, you've seen those results. Let's say during COVID, there was a lot more domestic violence, and it walked its way into the churches or became more apparent in the churches, but churches didn't know how to handle it. They wanted to do standard Christian counseling, which is the exact opposite of domestic violence counseling. Right. And so it became awkward. A couple of months ago, I had someone who I have known has been a domestic violence victim for close to 20 years, who finally reached out and said, I need to leave. And her church stepped up and helped, but that was the impetus. I finished talking to her and I got on the phone with you and I said, this conference has to happen. The churches are struggling. Like, I've known that all along, but the churches are struggling. We have to stop talking about the fact that we need a conference.
Yeah, so one of the hallmarks of the Faith Rising Conference is that we're bringing together churches from the 4 counties of the Capital District. We have Albany, Rensselaer, Saratoga, and Schenectady. All those churches together with the licensed domestic violence service provider in each of those counties. So we're going to have a forum for pastors to be able to talk to one another about what's happening in their churches, but also having hands-on training by those domestic violence service providers so that they can leave with a safe church protocol and have plans in place so that when this stuff comes up, they know exactly what to do.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's so important, because there's so much at stake. Like, we tend to think, the public tends to think about the domestic violence victim, right? But you also have a perpetrator who may be in that church that needs to be cared for and be held accountable. Right. And then you have the children that are potentially involved, or other family members that are involved. And so it can be if that family has been in your church for a long time, it can be very detrimental to your church family to suddenly have this domestic violence situation in the middle. But it isn't really sudden. It's just you become aware of it.
That's correct. So you have, a lot of times these things are bubbling under the surface for a very long time. And people, a lot of times perpetrators of domestic violence can wear a mask. So you don't even realize what's happening behind closed doors if you only see them at their Sunday best.
Yeah, this is true. In my case, it bubbled under the surface for quite a while. My son, 7 years before I asked my husband to leave, had actually gone to the pastor and said, my dad when my mom's not home, my dad yells at me and curses at me, and my younger siblings, and nothing was really done. It was sort of taken as parents have the right to discipline their children. Now, I don't, if he even really caught the curse part of that or understood what he meant by that.
But there actually was a pretty significant escalation that occurred at the church that really changed the trajectory. Right. What happened?
So 2 years later, I had gone into church early. I was working in children's ministry, taking the rest of my kids. My husband and my son came later, and they got in a fight in the car, and my husband picked my 9-year-old son up and threw him against the brick wall outside our church building. My son came in screaming and yelling, and we always had security down there, so security grabbed him, and somebody else from security grabbed my husband, and they kept them separate. And at the end of the service, they tried to deal with it, but they didn't do a great job of dealing with it. I never really understood that this was actually, it was child abuse at that point.
Correct.
And
that must have been terrifying for a 9-year-old to be picked up by a grown man and thrown into a brick wall.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was. And I've never thought my son's reaction wasn't appropriate.
Right.
In that moment. They handled things well. They reported it to CPS, but they didn't handle the internal family things.
So your ex-husband was not just a congregant. He actually was in leadership at that church. He
was part of the children's ministry at that church. Yeah, he was part of the Royal Rangers was our boys program, and he was one of the leaders in the Royal Rangers. And they neither when my son complained that he was swearing at him or when he threw him against the wall, did they remove my husband from ministry.
So, wow. And I just want to pause there, because that's really where there could have been an effective intervention. Mm-hmm. But not only that, when you're actually witnessing the abuse happening at the church, to allow that person to continue having access to not only his own child but other children,
right,
is really concerning.
Yeah. It was, and it didn't really hit me in the moment that they didn't pull him from ministry, or I might have said something. I had been children's ministry coordinator several years ago in a different church, and I had pulled people from ministry for things not quite that severe, but similar. I'm not liking the way you handle your child. I'm not going to let you serve in our ministry till we know you're more stable. But I think because the chaos and the abuse was already going on, and it was so it was unexpected but sort of anticipated, I guess, in my head, that it didn't occur to me to say, hey, why are you not pulling him out of ministry? Or why aren't you pulling all of us out of ministry? Right? I was serving ministry too, right? And it's my kids going through this, right? And I'm going through this. Like, why did you not intervene then?
Right. Considering or having a conversation with you about what your emotional or cognitive mm-hmm. load would be at that time.
Right.
Are you able to serve while you're going through an active crisis or active trauma?
Yeah. And in fact, at the time, they sat and met with us afterwards, and the pastor actually asked me, do you think this will happen again?
Now, I want to pause right there, because you said they met with us. Do you mean that they met with you and my
ex-husband
at the same time?
At the same time.
So they asked you this in front of him?
In front of him.
While you're sitting there?
Mm-hmm.
But if you did think that he was going to be dangerous to you and the children, what would be the anticipated result of asking in front of the person who would potentially be hurting you?
Right. And I think that question, comes from the Christian counseling stand of, is this kind of normal behavior, or do you expect this to happen again? Without understanding the risk it was putting myself and my family at. I very bravely said yes. If he does not get some counseling and get his temper under control, it's going to happen again. And the words that popped out of my pastor's mouth were, that's not very supportive as a wife.
Wow, that's not very supportive as a wife. So what did he have to say about your husband's behavior? Was that supportive of a husband? Or as supportive behavior as a father?
I think I've blocked most of that conversation out, to be honest with you. But no, there was, we're disappointed in you. We think you should be better. If you're having trouble with your kid, come find somebody to help you. but not any real, you did something really wrong kind of attitude.
Well, so now I'm just thinking in my own situation where things got really twisted, any kind of advice or support. So I can't even imagine what it would be like to have an abuser told that his wife is not supportive enough of him from an authority figure. What did that look like when you got home and things continued to deteriorate?
Right. So over the next 5 years, things deteriorated. The last year was especially bad. And I frequently heard from my husband, you're not very supportive. You don't support me as a father. And even the pastors at our church know that.
Yeah. I heard something similar. My ex was not a Christian during our marriage, but once he got caught doing certain things, he wanted to come to Jesus. And so he briefly was attending church in a men's group, and he would come home and say, well, the men's group says that 1 Peter 3:5-7 says that no matter what I do to you, you have to submit to me and obey me. Which, if anyone's read the 3rd chapter of Peter, that's not really what it's about. It's about mutual respect. But they will take, if guys are looking for an excuse to continue acting in a certain way, they can take any comment like that and really just twist it and try to use it as a weapon against someone who is really God-fearing and trying to do the right thing.
Right. Yeah. And that was really very, very detrimental to my mental health in that process. When I finally did get the strength to say, you need to leave. And it was, again, when he attacked my child, it was hard to just be sure I was doing the right thing. Like I knew, like God was there going, you're doing the right thing. But it was still really hard because in my head, I'm not supportive enough. And if I would have been more supportive, maybe he wouldn't be in this position.
Right, it made you responsible for his behavior, but we are responsible for our own behavior.
Absolutely.
And I'm so sorry that you had that experience. And it's so hard because you're trying to protect your children, and you're trying to protect yourself. But as moms, we know that I would throw myself, I would do anything for my children,
Absolutely.
Right? Way before I would do something for myself.
Yeah.
Right? Like we eat last, right?
Yeah.
Right? Our kids need to go to the park, our exercise waits. They have homework, our classes wait. We always put our kids first.
Absolutely.
So I can see in your eyes that this is a really hard thing to relive, and I appreciate you trusting me enough to sit here and tell this story.
Yeah, I've told this story a lot actually at this point. I regularly counsel with women who have a domestic violence past, and I've never cried before, and I don't know why I'm doing it now, but
that's okay. That's okay.
But yeah, it is. But it's part of the reason why I really believe churches really have to get the handle on really what is going on here, and how to deal with it appropriately. Because, like I said early on, it is the exact opposite of what you think of and you learn when you're talking about Christian counseling session.
Yeah, so I was here in the studio last week meeting with Alicia, interviewed me, and she asked what was one thing that I thought that churches could do differently, and I said never couples counseling when there's been domestic violence. It is so incredibly unsafe, and sometimes it might be hard to know if there is DV going on when you first get in, so it has to be something that is screened for. But if you're seeing violence in the home, it is not, that woman is not safe to be in that room.
No. And even if it's not physical violence, if it's, spiritual violence, well, you can't get a divorce because, you're a Christian and God doesn't allow that, or, it's putting her on a really tight budget and you can't do things, or, all that kind of mental health kind of torment that they do. It's so hard sometimes for that victim to recognize that they are a victim if there isn't an actual, I don't have a broken bone.
Right.
Or it's not that bad.
Right.
And that gets lost sometimes, I think, especially in churches where if the victim thinks it's not that bad, the church goes along with that theory. Oh, it's not that bad. It's
also really, this is something that I've seen. If I am sitting there talking to you and I say, oh, I'm divorced and there was domestic violence, and you come back and say, well, you have to forgive your husband, and does he want to reconcile because you're biblically bound to do so, or some other twisting, I'm not going to tell you anything else because you're
Right.
not a safe person to disclose to.
Right.
But if you say, I'm sorry that happened to you,
Yeah.
is this something that you want to, work through together? Then I might be willing to tell you everything that's going on. So I think our initial response to somebody really sets the tone on if it's safe to disclose.
Yes.
Or if they're just going to be silent because this is not a person who's going to help me, and talking might actually be more dangerous.
Right. And I think especially when pastors get up and preach really strong messages about, relationships between husband and wives, where they focus more on husband's spiritual authority instead of the husband as Jesus loving the church and his wife, that automatically sets a tone for I'm not safe to tell what's going on. And so even in the everyday sermons or in just your regular conversations, you have to remember that even though they're both standing there in your church building proclaiming to be Christians, if there's violence, there's a problem.
Yes.
And you have to deal with it.
I think forgiveness is another one that gets twisted by abusers often.
Mm-hmm.
So forgiveness is absolutely a keystone to the Christian faith, but forgiveness doesn't equal reconciliation.
No.
And forgiveness doesn't mean putting yourself or your children in an unsafe position. So I think we have to be really careful when we're talking about forgiveness, that it's safety first. Forgiveness is part of the healing process once you're safe.
Right.
And it's for you. It doesn't mean that you have to be back in an unsafe situation.
Right.
It's about turning that hurt over to God so that you can be healed and made whole.
Right. And God gave me really what I think is the perfect biblical, it is the perfect biblical example of just that. And it actually occurs when Jesus is dying on the cross. So if you are offering somebody forgiveness, the words you say are, I forgive you.
Right.
On the cross, Jesus did not say, I forgive you. He said,
Forgive
God,
them, Father.
you have to forgive them, right? Forgive them, Father. They know not what they do. He can't, as a human, issue, I forgive you. But he knows, as the Godhead, he has to, right? And so there is forgiveness issued off of that cross, but it's not done by the human dying on the cross. It's done by the Godhead in heaven, right? But then he comes back to earth. Reconciliation is a huge piece of what we get yelled at a lot in domestic violence, right? You need to reconcile, you need to try again. There are hundreds of people who talk about seeing Jesus after he came back to life. But he never appeared to the Pharisees and Sadducees. He never appeared to the Romans. He didn't appear to the people who killed him.
This is true.
He did not reconcile with them.
Because
forgiveness and reconciliation
are separate, but repentance is that huge piece.
Right.
And so to repent is to turn away from the sin and to turn to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't have that, there is a separation. I think one of the first boundaries that we ever see is in the Bible, where you have Adam and Eve,
mm-hmm.
and there's the sin, and God takes them out of the garden, right? So whether he forgave them or not, he still created a clear boundary, and he even put a cherub with a flaming sword to protect the entrance. Like, you were not responsible with the access that you had. Now you no longer have that access.
Right.
And that was one of the first things that we see God do after creation.
Yeah. Because God is very capable of drawing boundaries and saying, I will still have a relationship with you, but you will not have access to that really beautiful space right there.
Right. We have, and so I think the idea that we can have boundaries is 100% biblical, and it's necessary for our safety many times.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Even if it's not our physical safety, it's our mental health safety, it's our spiritual safety. It's feeling like the God of the universe actually cares about what's happening to me.
And he does this moment. That's Elroy, right? When we have this story in the Bible of Abraham, and we see God sees us. He sees our struggles. He sees us in the desert place. He sees our children struggling, dying of thirst, and he is right there with us.
He is, yeah. And so it's just so important that we handle that with clarity, that we know what the symptoms look like. I when I was talking to my pastor later, about a year later after I kicked my husband out and we were going to family court, and he agreed to come in family court and testify that he did not think my husband was safe to have full custody of the kids, or even a whole lot of visitation. And he just said, I wish I knew back then that was an early warning sign of all of this, right?
So what do you hope that pastors get out of the summit on January 20th?
So I have sort of two sides to this hope. I hope that they can recognize the early warning signs, or recognize when it's hidden, because there's cracks there. Like you recognize the cracks, you just don't know what they are. And making time to make sure that there's somebody in your church who's equipped to sort of have a conversation with the husband and have a conversation with the wife, and start to see if those cracks are something that can be more easily repaired, just a difficult moment in life, or if that is really that there's violence going on, or that there's abuse going on of some sort. And that ability to just stop thinking it can't be that bad because they're Christians and they're both showing up to church.
Right.
And the other is to have a good, solid response if that level of violence comes into the church. Like if it's not, you missed the early warning signs, but here it is live and in person, right? I was very blessed that at no point did my church suggest that we go to marriage counseling together once I kicked him out. Now, we did marriage counseling together lots of times going up to that, and every single marriage and parenting class. And in fact, when I kicked my husband out, one of the leaders of one of those groups said, well, I'm glad to see you finally decided that parenting classes and marriage classes are not going to solve this problem.
It's funny that you say that, because I also had the same thing. I can't tell you how many weekends to remember, and marriage classes and parenting classes, especially as the unsafe behaviors were being turned towards the children, that we did through the church, trying to do it. By the time that I left too, it was the same, like people were like, finally, right? But I felt like I had to do everything in my power, but it's in my power, right? It's not my power, it's not my responsibility, just like it wasn't yours.
Right.
So I get that. And thank God church was a sanctuary for me. It sounds like it was a sanctuary for you too, where you felt supported. And it is my hope that through this summit that we're doing, that everyone who comes into the church and discloses intimate partner violence will have that same sanctuary feeling.
Right. And I think too, and this always kind of surprises me, but I have an absolute passion that the churches don't dump the abuser.
Yeah, you and I talked about this a little bit, yes.
That it's so important that the abuser be someplace where he is held accountable.
So tell me about that. What happened in your situation that brought you here?
So in my situation, so my husband he bounced to another church that he was pretty familiar with, that we had looked at one point when we were changing churches. And then he bounced a few more churches, but in every church he went to, it was, my wife kicked me out, and he had lost his job not long before I kicked him out, which was part of the escalation of the mental health issues and that kind of stuff.
Girl, same.
But because he had lost his job, he would go around saying, I lost my job and my wife kicked me out. And so because nobody else knew him and nobody else knew me, they just took his story.
Right, but the people, the ministers and the pastors at your church knew the full story.
Right.
And had he stayed there, he would have been held accountable and not been able to kind of spin his
and
tail.
they never actually banned him from the church. They did put a game plan in place where my children and I sat in the balcony. He sat on the first floor, far on the other side of the building, on the other side of the sanctuary. They had game plans for us coming and going to make sure, and we had a large security team, and they were totally prepared to enforce whatever they needed to enforce, which was great. It was very reassuring to me. And he did come, I know he did come in during the middle of the week sometimes and talk to our pastors, but he wasn't receptive to the things that they were trying to say. He wanted to come in and just complain about how bad I was.
Right.
And he did that for almost a year. before he stopped showing up randomly in our church to complain about how bad I was, and I wouldn't let the kids see him, even though I never told my children they couldn't go. I always told my children, you need to use your judgment. And if they refused to go, I never forced them to go, because they recognized his behavior just as much as I did.
Well, and they were receiving the brunt of the abuse.
They were. Especially my oldest. Yeah.
So for someone who's on the fence, wondering if they should come on January 20th or not, what would you want them to know?
So I think that every church needs to send someone.
Yes.
And that I would rather see every church send two, because I think sometimes you don't hear things the same way.
Right.
And so I think more people in there. But if you are large enough to have a security team, your security team needs to be there.
Send the head of security.
Ushers, and if you have parking lot attendants would have seen what was going on in my home. Right? Parking lot attendants were not standing there when my husband threw my son against the wall, but they would have seen the other times he got out yelling at my kids, right? So having them equipped to be able to say, hey, I think there might be a problem here.
Right.
You know, this is 3 weeks in a row the dads come out yelling at the kids.
And also knowing who to go to. So if somebody
Yes.
witnesses this, or somebody walks through the door and discloses, who does that welcoming committee, parking lot team, who do they go to?
Right.
What we're creating there is a safe church template, so that will become the backbone of a policies and procedures for a church. So these things can be thought of in advance, so that when they
Right.
do happen, we know what to do.
Yeah, because that's really important. Because it's happening in your church. If you've got more than 4 couples in your church, it's happening in your church. You
Right.
just haven't recognized it yet.
So I thought about this looking at my church. So I go to Loudonville Community Church, which is where the summit's happening, and we have this huge sanctuary, and counting up, the ushers come through and count up the people who are in there. And I was thinking, every 4th woman, every 6th woman on the pew has experienced domestic violence statistically. Right. So as a pastor is standing there looking out in his congregation, figure one woman on every pew has
Yep.
experienced this. So it's there.
Yeah. And don't forget, it's not just women.
That's right.
Sometimes it's the men, right? And they report less, but they are just as badly abused often.
Right. So statistically, it is more frequently the women who are abused, and that goes into the power and control dynamic. Mm-hmm. But you're absolutely right. We have to be educated that it can happen to either person, and making sure that we're responding appropriately and being able to tease out.
Right. And sometimes it's just, sometimes the abuse kind of builds and both sides are not great, and so by the time you get involved, you're not actually sure where the problem is.
Right.
Certainly that was the case in I did all sorts of things trying to get my husband to stop behaving the way he was, and a lot of them were not good choices along the way. And it took even my kids about 6 months to go, wait, no, mom is actually the safe person who is not going to do wild and crazy things, and dad is the person that we need to avoid. But it took them a while to be sure to be able to tease out, and
part of that is that the abuser will often say, well, it's not me, it's mom's the problem. Or, the other person, that there's a lot of projection that happens in those kinds of relationships, which is another reason why I'm so glad that we have the 4 DV agencies coming in to do that training, that they can kind of take some of that burden off the pastors to provide trauma-informed counseling and care. There's so many services that our DV agencies provide that a lot of people aren't even aware of.
Correct. Yeah.
Including housing and advocates that will go to the police with them, or advocates that will go to family court, shelters. There's so much that's available that it's a game changer once the whole door's open.
It is. And actually it was a friend from church who showed up the first time my husband was arrested, and I had to go to police report and make a police report, and I texted her and I'm like, he showed up and he's been arrested, and I don't know what to do now. And she texted me back, she says, you have to go to to city court or to the police office, right? And I said, yeah. And I walked in and she was sitting there.
She was waiting for you.
Yeah.
And doesn't that support mean everything? Everything. The support that I got from my family and friends and my church family, it was the absolute difference, because if I had to do it on my own, I don't know if I would have had the strength to. It was God, and it was the people around me that supporting me.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
Karen, I want to just thank you so much for coming in here and sitting with me today. We are talking about Faith Rising, the church's response to domestic violence, a summit for pastors and ministry leaders that is taking place on Tuesday, January 20th from 9 a.m. to noon at Loudonville Community Church in Loudonville, New York.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, and thank you for really, this is your baby. Like, we kind of started it together, but this is your baby, and you have run it, and I am so appreciative of that.
You're my firecracker, and I appreciate you.
It's good skills. We each have different sets of skills, but yeah.
Thank you, Karen.
All right, thank you.